Tawanna is the founder and chief executive of the Center for Economic Inclusion, an unprecedented, cross-sector social enterprise committed to strengthening the Minneapolis-St. Paul's region civic infrastructure and its collective capacity to disrupt systems and influence market forces to catalyze shared prosperity and advance an inclusive economy. So cross-sector, disrupting systems and influencing market forces. That's what we're here talking about today, and that's what Tawanna Black is leading at the national level in her community of Minneapolis-St. Paul. So without further ado, our keynote speaker, Tawanna Black.
It is so wonderful to be here with you. I have received the most wonderful welcome from not only the team at the foundation, but also from each of you. I don't think that I want to go back home. It has just been absolutely wonderful. And I rarely say that. I've got a wonderful family. So thank you so much for this warm welcome. It is just fabulous to be able to be in a room of people who are so committed and so inspired to be doing this type of work, who can articulate what they mean when they use the words economic inclusion or inclusive growth, creating a community in a region and a city that can both be unified and can be growing economically, can be doing that through a lens of inclusion, but who also are willing to acknowledge that it's hard, that we don't have the answers for what that looks like, who can acknowledge that doing this is going to mean that we've got to do some passing of the torch, that maybe we're not ready to pass the torch, that maybe it means some people need to grab the torch and take that torch and run with it, that it's exciting to be able to have young people come in the room and kick off the morning with spoken word that goes beyond the bounds of typical spoken word to challenge our notions of power and our notions of community, our notions of very meaning and purpose and definition, and economics and organization, to challenge the notions of sectors and neighborhoods and community, and that those people still stay in the room by the time we get to noon is amazing. So give yourselves a round of applause. It's wonderful to be here with you. That is the kind of work that I really love to do, and I tend to be a girl who loves the local. Don't worry, I won't try to balance two MacBooks up here for very long at all. But it's the work that I tend to love to do is very local, and yet as the calls to be able to go share the work that we're doing across the country with others, and then occasionally to be able to stay longer and actually consult with organizations and leaders and help do that work more deeply in communities have increased. I and my team are finding that work just as enjoyable as we find the work in our own community in Minneapolis-St. Paul, because ultimately we are in this together. Ultimately, there is not one city or community across the country that has figured this out. And by this, I mean the work of determining how we not only grow our economy, how we make sure that our gross regional product is growing, and we're seeing that number go up, and we're seeing businesses thrive and be able to grow their own sales and profitability at the same time that we're seeing folks at the lowest rungs of our economic ladder find their way up that ladder. And in particular, that we're seeing folks of color who are at the lowest rungs of that ladder find their own pathways up that ladder, and that those pathways don't stop, that they don't look different for those communities from a numbers perspective, but that they're able to set their own paths of destiny, and that they could look different in terms of form and function. They could look different in terms of creative economies. And that would be okay, that we could see growth happen in many, many forms at the same time that the economy grows. Everyone across our country is struggling with that, so it's an honor to be able to be here with you. I want to do my thank yous right out of the gate and say a big thank you to Will for the invitation, a big thank you to Christina and Lee and to Kalila and to Rich and the entire board and team of the Greater New Haven Community Foundation. They've been a pleasure to work with, and it was an honor to be able to get the call to come here for today. I want to also acknowledge the work of our team, and being here. What I'm going to do today is spend some time talking about the call to building more inclusive growth and the work that it takes to do that, and then tell you about the work that we do at the Center for Economic Inclusion. And the reality is, many of us spend an enormous amount of time in rooms that look like this, sometimes in rooms that don't look nearly as diverse as this, but talking about issues that are related to something about economic inclusion or inclusive growth, workforce development, education, economic development, transportation, housing, you name it. We spend an enormous amount of time each year gathered together working on these issues. An enormous amount of dollars pour into these issues and opportunities, and sometimes we count ourselves as moving the needle on them, as you see measured outside these doors. And other times we look at ourselves and say, what are we doing with ourselves? What are we doing with our lives? Have we moved the needle at all? Have we really wasted our time, or have we dedicated our time to something that was really worth it? Because when we look at the numbers, we struggle. And other times we see ourselves being applauded and lauded by national publications and say, okay, yay, our region or our community is doing well. In my community in Minneapolis, St. Paul, we often top lists of top manufacturing city or top city for young professionals or top city for that. And then we dig under the surface and say, but for who? In fact, here in this room today, a few of you have come to me to say, Minneapolis was great for this. And if you see me do one of these faces, it's a kind of a smile that's peeking out from underneath a not so much a smile. We call that Minnesota nice. That's because it's like, yep, that's true, but for who? A city that is great for doing business in some neighborhoods. A city that is great to raise a family if you don't look like me. A city that is great for home ownership rates if you make about $200,000 a year or more. And that story is beginning to be true in way too many cities across our country. But we spend a lot of time studying those statistics and unfortunately celebrating too many of the wrong statistics, and yet many of the people who count on people like you and people like me to go to work every day and get it right, they study a different set of numbers than those numbers at all. They study numbers like 3. Will we have 3 meals a day today? And they study numbers like 8. What will it take to piece together enough jobs to have 8 hours a day of work? Enough jobs, whether those are gig economy jobs or piece together jobs or part-time jobs or jobs that do have benefits today but may not have benefits next month, but enough jobs to really feel like I have 8 hours of work today, 40 hours of work for the week, and 4 weeks worth of work for the month. They study numbers like 18. The 18 years that each one of us who are parents hope for of opportunity on the day that we give birth or the day that we find out that we're carrying a child. They study that number with hopes that their children will live to see that number, that the crime that is permeating so many cities across our country will not cut those hopes short far, 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 far too early for absolutely no reason at all. And maybe there are other people who study numbers like $15,000. $15,000, the number that it costs to refill a job that is open again, because once again, this wonderful workforce development system that we herald has failed again. Once again, all the training, all the partnership, all the hope went out the door because once again, that job I just filled is open again, and that supervisor is looking at me in the HR department and saying, why can't those people stay? Won't those people work? Won't those people come to work? Won't those people work harder? $15,000. And yet, why? Why do we have such vast differences in our thoughts about these numbers? Recent studies tell us that despite the significant amount of time that many of us spend talking about and thinking about and studying these issues of inclusion and equity, that we still don't fully understand them. Even those of us who pride ourselves in being in philanthropy, and I'm a woman who led a funders collaborative with 20 corporate and family and community foundations for several years prior to creating the center. Those of us who have worked in the nonprofit sector for several years and are committed to being bleeding hearts, as it were. Those of us in the public sector who may be elected officials or education. Even us even us, that we still don't fully understand the depths of racial and economic inequities that exist in our country. When surveyed, even people of color don't fully understand the depths of racial and economic inequities that exist in our country and in our communities. Even now, as we find ourselves, as was mentioned this morning, 400 years almost to the day when the first ships arrived carrying enslaved Africans. Even now, even more years to the day of when the first ships arrived and claimed land for themselves that belonged to the first Native Americans of our country. Even now, we don't fully understand the depths of racial and economic inequities that plague us. And when we have misperceptions about that, misperceptions about the gaps that exist on the poster boards outside, it causes us to also have mis-solutions, wrong solutions that cause us to apply the wrong prescriptions. If you think about it, in a health sense, every person in here, I'm sure, has had some health challenge in the last year. And you think about it, that you tell your friends that you've got an ache, you tell your family members that you've got an ache, and suddenly everybody has a solution. Everybody is able to tell you what they would do if you had that ache. It's the same thing, that we have these challenges, and yet we suddenly start prescribing things without fully understanding what is the challenge. Where did the challenge begin? Without fully understanding our history and how that history continues to plague our present, we cannot fully articulate solutions. And so our challenge and solution are tied together. And I want to challenge you to think about what is required. And in our community, I've challenged the leaders to think about a couple of things. And those are dismantling some privileges that we carry in order to do that. And I'm sure one privilege just came to mind as I said that, as an African-American woman coming into a community. Like, I bet I know what privilege she's going to talk about. I bet you don't. I'm going to challenge you to take on 3 privileges. The first is the privilege of complacency. While I know you were motivated to come here today, and I'm giving you a lot of credit for that, I saw a post going on in the app about what will we do, and a big kudos to the man who started that post. I don't see strong enough answers coming in for that post and that question about, but what will we do? We'll talk and we'll learn today, and that's big. But what will we do? Every person here has personal agency, no matter what your title is and how high it is or how low it is in the institution you're in. Going back out of here defeated by the numbers is not okay. We can't continue to operate in the privilege of complacency that says, dang, it's a hard problem. It is. And it is solvable. I also challenge you to give up the privilege of empathy that fails to equip us with the tools for intentional action. Empathy is important. I tend to score pretty low on it because it doesn't move us to action. Empathy that causes us to feel but doesn't move us past that to action is useless. Get past the empathy if it doesn't move you to action. We must respond in ways that mirror what Taj shared with us this morning and motivates us to rearrange and change what is in order to include. And give up the privilege of ignorance. Contrary to what we've heard, what you don't know can hurt you. And in fact, it is. It's hurting all of us. We have a requirement as influencers, as action takers and leaders, to take action, to know, to be fully informed about every data point that is outside and every data point in the book that is included that they come from. And as we give up these privileges, we then have an opportunity to make a new choice, to begin choosing inclusion. And that moves me to how we go about doing that with this data before you. So you've had a chance to look at the mission. So I'm going to go quickly beyond the mission statement of the center into what it is we do and why we created the center. In our region, we found that we had lots of organizations, just like you do, just like every community does. But those organizations were approaching their work from this perspective that while they wouldn't call it charity, when you boil it back down, too many people, particularly in the private sector, would see it as charity. How can we help those people? How can we improve those statistics and outcomes? Not seeing it from a business perspective. We did not have strong accountability from sector to sector, meaning that nonprofits could hold the private sector accountable. Philanthropy could hold public sector accountable. We were not able to look across the table and say, you said you were going to do this, did you do it? Why not? How do we move the needle forward, moving forward year to year? We also saw that we struggled to have regional leaders who could keep their eye on a particular neighborhood and place for longer than a few months. Place-based change is critical in being able to move the needle at a city level and at a regional level, but too often we look at neighborhoods that are impoverished, neighborhoods that have been marginalized and disinvested in for years as charity projects. Let's go fix that for a little bit. And we don't think about the assets that exist in those neighborhoods, the people and the land, as assets in being able to address regional economic opportunity. We needed to be able to change that paradigm. And while we had innovation that was occurring in our region, whether that was transit-oriented development or other facets, we weren't seeing that innovation at a pace that would scale across our region, and we needed data to be able to address that. All of those things put together focused on why we said we needed one organization that could be able to address this issue and scale it across the region wholesale. The work that we take on, really, if you look at the circle, is what it addresses. And I believe we've got materials, though I don't think you have them. And so we'll be sure that you're able to grab those at some point today, that we'll talk about this work a little more deeply. And we had our website up online where you can look at the work more deeply too. But everything we do is through the lens of race, place, and income, and through the lens of economic development, workforce development and human capital, transportation, and access. Our three objectives are here for you on the screen. We connect all the work that we do inside organizations, particularly focused on the public and private sectors. We're leveraging the market here, and that's the biggest differentiator in everything that we do. For a very long time, all communities, not just ours, but I wouldn't say all, many communities, nothing's absolute, have gone about the issues of being able to address growth and being able to think about how you solve for racial and economic inequities, largely relying on the public and nonprofit and social sectors. And we've sat in many, many rooms trying to guess what it would take to have the private sector there wholesale. Sometimes we have private sector foundations there, occasionally we have private sector HR, but we don't have the business there. Thinking about how business moves from a sales perspective, how business invests, where business is going to locate in the future, how jobs are going to grow, and what's driving those decisions. Our premise is that if we're going to solve for growth and economic inclusion together, we have to have business there driving those decisions using a business lens. Everything that we do at the Center for Economic Inclusion in our region, everything the center does to influence other decisions across our region is through that lens. The market informs it. It's centering people of color as assets in those decisions, data informed, leading toward those two measurements. Our end-all be-all is our economy growing and our people of color getting to parity with whites in jobs, income, and wealth. Period. No more, no less. We do that by helping public and private sector employers change the way that they operate, products, marketing, and services. And I'm going to go to Q&A in a moment, so I'm going to skip past this. One of the things that's critical, though, is how we measure that and why we got to this. And it's the same way that you did. We had data that said we are not working. We're failing, essentially, that we're seeing our growth, and this is Brookings Data, who's our big data partner. Our data says that while our market has been thriving for a very long time, these inequities are starting to hurt us. So we said, okay, our decision makers need to be better informed, and they're not just gonna do it because Tawanna said it's something nice to do, even though I'm kind of popular. We're gonna need more than that. So how do we have indicators that help our region start to change? And the materials that you'll see in a moment produce ultimately 14 indicators for economic inclusion that help our region's decision makers start to say in a very fine way, what are indicators that every decision maker and every policy maker needs to have their eyes on in order to know if our region is moving forward or moving backwards? Yes, thinking about employment and wages, because those things are critical. But too often we look at those things and we marginalize it and say, those are poor people. Those are people who didn't graduate from our high schools, particularly in low-income areas, and if that school system would just get their act together, we'd be good. And yes, that has to happen. But we also look at things like, what's the percentage of middle-income households who are getting approved for mortgages? When we looked at that in our region, we found that households of color
who are middle income, making $100,000 or more, were not being approved for mortgages. Wait a minute, redlining still happening? Yep, still happening. That spoke to bias happening in our region and the need for taking on those privileges, the need for taking on institutional bias. We looked at business loans to say, are business loans happening in all neighborhoods? And are business loans taking place against all races? How do we start to address that and look at it from an investment perspective? The same is true for graduation rates from colleges in all disciplines, and are those graduates then getting jobs in our marketplace, a place where we have a significant number of Fortune 5 businesses who are desperate for workers. That disaggregation of data across race, across place, and across income allows decision makers to start making a lot better choices. And this data will make this available to you. Really starts to speak to the brochure that you'll see in just a little bit. The last thing I would say to you before we go to Q&A is we have to be able to set goals. In each one of your organizations, the goals that you establish determine what you do and ultimately determines who moves the needle. In our region, in the last 10 years, despite a lot of effort, we've closed the wage gap by 1%. I'd encourage you to measure that for your region. What I said to our business leaders that ultimately motivated action was, if that happened in any other business, a lot of people would get fired. And yet, when it comes to issues like those of economic inclusion and inclusive growth, a lot of people have meetings. Now it's time for a lot of people to either get on the train and start to see that number change, or a lot of organizations to close and move out of the way. One or the other. That is the rally call that we have, and ultimately the choice is ours as to what we do about moving the needle, and the choice is yours as to what you do as a region to be able to move growth in your economy and know that you can also move the needle for all communities in a way that makes sure your economy continues to grow and make sure that you're competitive and inclusive at the same time. Thank you.